What if I told you that the most vicious bloodbath in the history of the Royal Navy didn't happen in a battle against the French? It happened in the dead of night, behind the closed doors of a British frigate, where the crew didn't just revolt. They butchered their officers and handed their ship to the enemy. It was a stain so dark, a betrayal so absolute, that the Admiralty wanted it wiped from the face of the earth. But before we dive into this tale of ghosts and gore, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We deal in the grit, the glory, and the cold hard steel of history, right here. Join us and let's set sail. In 1799, if you stood on the sun-bleached docks of Puerto Cabello, you would have seen her. The HMS Hermione. But she wasn't flying the Union Jack anymore. She was sitting under the shadow of 200 Spanish guns, flying the colours of Spain, a prize of war that had been gifted to the enemy by her own sailors. To the British, she was a ghost. A haunting reminder of what happens when leadership fails and discipline turns into tyranny. Every time a British officer looked at a map of the Caribbean, that ship was there, watching, mocking. It was a wound that wouldn't heal. You see, the Royal Navy of the 18th century was the most sophisticated war machine on the planet, but it was held together by a very thin, very bloody thread of authority. When that thread snapped on the Hermione, it didn't just break, it shattered. The mutiny was so violent, so savage, that it sent shockwaves all the way back to London. Imagine, if you will, a modern equivalent. It would be like a rogue unit of the SAS, killing their commanders today and defecting to a hostile power with a nuclear sub. It wasn't just a loss of hardware, it was a loss of honor. The Spanish felt untouchable. And why wouldn't they? The Hermione was more deep within a natural fortress. To get to her, you'd have to row past batteries of heavy cannons that could turn a wooden boat into toothpicks in seconds. It was a suicide trap. The Spanish commanders probably sat on their verandas, sipping sherry, looking at that beautiful frigate and thinking the British would never dare. They thought the British had accepted the loss. They thought the Hermione was a closed chapter, but they didn't account for the silent service mentality. They didn't account for the fact that the Royal Navy has a very, very long memory. Back then, a ship like the Hermione was worth about £4.5 million in today's money. But her value and pride? That was incalculable. The Admiralty didn't just want the ship back. They wanted to send a message to every sailor in the fleet. You can run, you can hide, and you can flip your coat, but we will come for you. The man they chose for this impossible task wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't a man of subtle words. Captain Edward Hamilton was a man of action. He was the kind of officer who looked at a fortress bristling with 200 cannons and didn't see a wall. He saw a challenge. He knew that to wash out the stain of the Hermione, he couldn't just sink her from a distance. No. He had to go in. He had to stand on her decks. He had to take her back with the very same steel that had been used to steal her. This is where the legend begins. In the flickering candlelight of a cabin on the HMS Surprise, Hamilton began to sketch a plan that was, quite frankly, insane. He wasn't bringing a fleet, he was bringing 6 small boats. He wasn't bringing an army, he was bringing 100 men with muffled oars and sharpened cutlasses. This wasn't going to be a naval engagement, it was going to be a raid, a surgical strike in an age of blunt force trauma. The harbour of Puerto Cabello was about to become the stage for the most audacious Special Forces-style operation of the Georgian era. The Spanish thought the Hermione was safe in her grave. They thought the British were too broken by the betrayal to strike back. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The ghost was about to be exorcised, and the price of that exorcism would be paid in blood. To understand why the Hermione had to be retaken at any cost, we first have to understand why she was lost. And that story starts with one man. Captain Hugh Pigot. If you were looking for a nemesis in this tale, don't look to the Spanish. Look to the quarterdeck of the Hermione herself. Pigot wasn't just a strict disciplinarian. He was a tyrant. A man whose leadership style was built not on respect, but on a foundation of pure, unadulterated terror. In the Royal Navy of 1797, life was already hard. You were living on salted beef that was often years old, drinking watered-down rum, and working in conditions that would make a modern coal mine look like a luxury spa. But Pigot took that hardship and turned it into a masterclass in cruelty. He was obsessed with speed, specifically the speed at which his sailors could reef the sails climbing high into the rigging, often in gale-force winds, to tie down the canvas. Now, imagine being a topman. You're 200 feet above the crashing Atlantic, the ship is heaving, and your fingers are numb with cold. Above the roar of the wind, you hear Pigot's voice from the deck below. He had a rule: the last man down from the yardarm would be flogged. Just think about that for a second. It didn't matter how well you did your job. If you were the slowest, you bled. One fateful afternoon, Pigot's impatience finally curdled into a catastrophe. He screamed at the men aloft that the last man down would be whipped. In the desperate, panicked scramble to avoid the lash, 3 young sailors lost their footing. They fell. They didn't just fall to the deck, they fell past their horrified comrades and smashed onto the hardwood or vanished into the sea. And Pigot? What was his reaction to this tragedy? He looked at their broken bodies and called them, and I quote, idle blackguards. Then, and I quote, idle blackguards. Then, he ordered the rest of the crew to be flogged anyway. That was the breaking point. That night, the thin scarlet thread of authority didn't just snap, it ignited. The mutiny that followed wasn't an organized protest, it was a slaughter. The crew didn't just want the ship, they wanted Pigot's soul. They burst into his cabin while he was eating dinner. They stabbed him repeatedly with bayonets and dull knives. They didn't give him the mercy of a quick death. As he lay bleeding on the floor, pleading for his life, they dragged him to a porthole and threw him, still screaming, into the dark Caribbean waters. But they didn't stop there. The rage was a contagion. They hunted down every officer on board. 9 of them were murdered in total. Some were hacked to death in their beds. Others were chased across the decks like animals. By dawn, the HMS Hermione was a floating charnel house. The decks, usually scrubbed white with holystone, were stained a deep, permanent crimson. This wasn't just a mutiny like the famous one on the Bounty. On the Bounty, they put the captain in a boat and let him live. On the Hermione, they left no witnesses they didn't trust. Now, imagine the tactical nightmare this created for the British Admiralty. A 32-gun frigate, a ship that would cost about £4.5 million to build today, had just disappeared. But more importantly, the men knew they could never go home. The penalty for mutiny was the noose. They were dead men walking. So, they did the unthinkable. They sailed the Hermione straight into Puerto Cabello and handed her to the Spanish. To the Spanish, this was a windfall. They renamed her the Santa Cecilia. They filled her with Spanish sailors and bolstered her with their own Marines. To the British, this was the ultimate insult. In the eyes of the law, the Hermione was no longer just a ship. She was a crime scene that had been sold to the enemy. Let's talk about the butcher's bill in modern terms. Losing a frigate like the Hermione wasn't just a blow to the budget, it was a hole in the blockade. It was a strategic asset now being used against you. But the real cost was the message it sent to every other crew in the fleet. If the Hermione crew got away with it, if they could live comfortably under Spanish protection after murdering their officers, what was to stop the next ship from doing the same? The Admiralty was terrified. They realized that if they didn't get that ship back, or sink her in her moorings, the very fabric of the Royal Navy might unravel. They needed a man who was as resolute as Pigot was cruel, but twice as tactical. They needed someone who understood that this wasn't just about wood and iron. It was about the sacred nature of the Naval Commission. The search for the mutineers began immediately. It was the 18th century version of an international manhunt. British agents were sent to every port in the Americas. They offered fortunes for information. Over the next decade, they would track down many of the Hermione mutineers, finding them in bars in Portsmouth, on American merchant ships, even in hiding in the streets of London. And one by one, they were brought to the yardarm and hanged. But the ship remained, sitting in that harbour, under those 200 guns, a constant, mocking reminder of the night the butcher Pigot pushed his men too far. Every day she sat there was a victory for Spain and a defeat for Britain. The bill was growing, and it was being paid in British prestige. The stage was set. The tragedy of the mutiny had created a vacuum of honour that only a miracle could fill. The Royal Navy didn't just want their ship back, they wanted a masterclass in redemption. They wanted a story so heroic, so impossibly brave, that it would drown out the screams of the night Pigot was murdered. And Edward Hamilton? He was sitting on the HMS Surprise, sharpened cutlass in hand, ready to lead 100 men into the mouth of that very same hell to settle the debt. To understand the man who would eventually lead this special forces mission of the 18th century, you have to understand the metal Edward Hamilton was forged from. He wasn't just another career officer. He was a man with a legacy to protect and a very specific, very deadly set of skills. While Hugh Pigot represented the worst of the Navy, the brittle, snapping bone of tyranny, Hamilton represented its sinew. He was the expert next-door commander. If your neighbour happened to be a tactical genius with a penchant for high-stakes gambling and cold steel, Hamilton was the younger son of a baronet. And in the class-conscious world of the 1790s, that meant he had to work twice as hard to earn the respect of his peers. He didn't just want a command. He wanted a reputation. By the time he was given the HMS Surprise, a fast, nimble 28-gun frigate, he had already developed a philosophy of leadership that was the polar opposite of the late unlamented Captain Pigot. Hamilton understood something many of his contemporaries missed. A crew that loves their ship will fight harder than a crew that fears their captain. Now, let's talk about the machine he commanded. The HMS Surprise was a masterpiece of naval architecture. She was originally a French ship, captured and recommissioned a prize in every sense of the word. She was lean, she was fast, and she was perfectly suited for the kind of hit-and-run warfare that Hamilton favoured. But Hamilton knew that a ship is just wood and canvas without the right men. He didn't just drill his crew, he obsessed over them. He focused on a tactic known as the cutting-out expedition. This was the 18th century equivalent of a modern Navy SEAL, VBSS, Visit, Board, Search and Seizure. It involved taking small, open rowboats, sneaking into an enemy harbour under the cover of darkness, and taking a ship by force while it was still at anchor. It was the most dangerous work in the Navy. One wrong splash of an oar, one nervous cough, and you were a sitting duck for every cannon on the shore. Hamilton made his men practice this until they could do it in their sleep. He taught them how to muffle their oars with old rags and socks. He taught them how to move like shadows. He was building a strike team, a group of maritime commandos who trusted him implicitly, and they needed to, because the target Hamilton had his eye on wasn't just any ship, it was the Hermione. To Hamilton, the Hermione wasn't just a tactical objective. It was a nemesis. It was a ghost that needed to be laid to rest. He spent weeks cruising off the coast of Puerto Cabello, peering through his telescope at the Spanish fortress. He wasn't just looking at the ship, he was calculating. He was looking at the currents, the wind patterns, and the timing of the Spanish sentries. Let's put the logistics of valor into modern terms. Today, we might spend millions of dollars on satellite imagery and drone reconnaissance before a raid of this scale. Hamilton had a brass telescope in his own eyes. The cost of this mission wasn't measured in taxpayer dollars, but in human capital. He was planning to take 100 men, roughly a third of his crew, and put them in 6 small boats. If he failed, he wasn't just losing a battle, he was gutting his own ship's ability to defend itself. It was a double-or-nothing bet with the lives of his men as the stakes. There was a moment, just before the raid, where the politics of the Navy almost shut the whole thing down. Higher-ups in the Admiralty were skeptical. They thought Hamilton was being reckless. They thought the risk to the HMS Surprise was too great. But Hamilton was resolute. He knew that the window of opportunity was closing. He knew that the longer the Hermione stayed in Spanish hands, the more the mutineers' victory would be etched into history. He gathered his men on the deck of the Surprise. He didn't give them a speech about king and country or dry naval regulations. He spoke to them about redemption. He told them that the eyes of the entire Royal Navy were on them. He promised them that if they followed him, they wouldn't just be taking a ship, they would be taking back their own collective honor. The technical stakes were immense. A cutting-out raid required 3 things to go perfectly: stealth, speed, and violence of action. If you lost stealth, you had to rely on speed. If you lost stealth, you had to rely on speed. If you lost stealth, you had to rely on pure, raw violence. Hamilton's plan accounted for all 3. He had his boarders, armed with cutlasses and tomahawks. He had his cable cutters, whose only job was to hack through the thick anchor ropes, and he had his sail losers, who had climbed the rigging of the Hermione while the fight was still raging to get the ship moving. It was a masterclass in tactical delegation. Hamilton knew he couldn't do everything himself. He had to trust his midshipmen. He had to trust his midshipmen. He had to trust his boatswains. He was the architect, but they were the hammers. As the sun began to set on the evening of October 24, 1799, Hamilton went to his cabin. He didn't write a scandalous letter or a formal report. He simply sharpened his sword. He knew that, by dawn, he would either be hero of the British Empire or a footnote in a Spanish casualty report. The man, the machine, and the mission were now one. The time for planning was over. The time for the silent service to speak, in the language of cold steel, had arrived. To truly understand the sheer audacity of what Edward Hamilton was about to attempt, you have to look at the map of Puerto Cabello. In 1799, this wasn't just a harbour, it was a throat, and the Spanish had their hands firmly around it. Imagine a deep, horseshoe-shaped bay, protected by the massive San Felipe Castle, a stone monster bristling with heavy artillery. We aren't talking about a few rusty cannons here. We are talking about 200 guns, ranging from nimble field pieces to massive 24-pounders that could skip a solid iron shot across the water like a stone on a pond. The Hermione, now the Santa Cecilia, wasn't just floating out in the open. She was moored deep within the inner harbour. Sitting directly under the batteries of the castle. She was literally within a stone's throw of the Spanish governor's windows. To get to her, Hamilton's men wouldn't just have to row into the bay. They would have to row into a crossfire. They would be surrounded by a crescent of steel and stone, with every gunner on the shore trained on the narrow entrance. It was, by every definition of the word, an impossible trap. Let's put this into a modern perspective for a moment. Imagine a small team of commandos in inflatable ribs trying to sneak into a heavily fortified naval base. Think Sevastopol or Pearl Harbor, while the entire base is on high alert. No GPS, no night vision, no suppressed weapons, just the rhythmic pull of wooden oars and the hope that the moon stays behind the clouds. The Spanish weren't stupid. They knew the British wanted their ship back. They had heard the rumors of the Hermione hunters prowling the Caribbean. So, they had prepared. They didn't just rely on the castle. They surrounded the Hermione with a ring of guardacostas, smaller gunboats and armed launches that patrolled the waters like hungry sharks. If a British boat was spotted, the alarm would go up. The harbour would be illuminated by flares and burning pitch, and the slaughter would begin. The friction of this mission started before a single boat hit the water. There was the weather. The Caribbean is unpredictable, and a sudden squall could scatter the small boats or swamp them entirely. Then there was the internal struggle. Hamilton's men were brave, but they weren't robots. They were human beings who knew the odds. They could see the lights of the Spanish town, hear the distant tolling of the church bells, and they knew that for many of them, that harbour would be their graveyard. But Hamilton had a secret weapon: precision. He didn't just plan to row in and hope for the best. He broke the harbour down into phases. He studied the scarlet caterpillar of his own boat's movement. He knew exactly how many minutes it would take to reach the Hermione's bow at a steady stroke. He knew the rotation of the Spanish sentries. This was a tactical documentary playing out in real time, 2 centuries before the cameras ever rolled. On the night of October 24th, the atmosphere on the HMS Surprise was electric. The men had been ordered to dress in dark clothing, no bright red coats tonight. They blackened their faces with cork and soot. This was the silent service at its most literal. They moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. Every man knew his seat. Every man knew his weapon. As they lowered the boats, the silence was absolute. This is where the expert next-door commander truly shines. Hamilton didn't shout orders from the quarterdeck of the Surprise. No, he climbed down into the lead boat himself. He sat in the stern, his hand on the tiller, his eyes locked on the dark silhouette of the San Felipe castle. He was leading from the front, sharing the risk, and breathing the same salty, nervous air as his youngest midshipman. The row-in was a masterclass in tension. Imagine the sound. The soft thud-thud of oars muffled by old socks, the occasional splash of a flying fish, the distant murmur of Spanish voices from the shore batteries. They were rowing past the muzzles of guns that could end their lives in a heartbeat. It was a vertical battlefield where the enemy was above them, looking down, waiting for a single mistake. Hamilton's nemesis wasn't just the Spanish commander, Don Felipe de Beria. It was the environment itself. The current was pulling against them, trying to drag the boats toward the rocks. The fog was rolling in, threatening to blind them. And then, the first bit of friction hit. One of the boats, carrying the surgeons and extra ammunition, began to lag behind. Hamilton had a choice: slow down and risk being caught by the dawn, or press on and hope they didn't need the extra help. He pressed on. As they neared the Hermione, the ship began to loom out of the darkness like a mountain of wood and cordage. She looked massive, her 32 guns silent but menacing. To the British sailors, she wasn't just a prize. She was the Holy Grail. They could see the Spanish sentries walking the decks, cigars glowing in the dark, completely unaware that 100 redcoats were currently floating just yards away in the shadows. The trap was set, and the British had walked right into the centre of it. But here is the thing about a trap. It only works if you stay in it. Hamilton didn't plan on staying. He planned on taking the trap, the ship, and the pride of the Spanish crown and sailing them all right out to sea. The tension was at its breaking point. A single cough, a dropped oar, even a sudden shift in the wind could trigger the alarm. They weren't to the guns. They were in the mouth of the beast. And Edward Hamilton, with a resolute expression and a hand on his sword, gave the signal. The impossible trap was about to be sprung, but not by the Spanish. Hamilton's plan wasn't just a mission. It was a choreography of chaos. He knew that if 100 men simply scrambled onto the Hermione at once, they would be bogged down in a confused melee and slaughtered by the superior Spanish numbers. No, he needed the precision of a watchmaker. He divided his force into 6 distinct boats, each with a specific surgical role to play. This was the Special Forces blueprint of 1799. First, we have the boarding parties. These were the tip of the spear. Hamilton himself led the first boat, followed closely by his 2 strongest divisions. Their job? To hit the Hermione's bow and quarterdeck. They weren't there to take the ship yet. They were there to seize the real estate. They needed to clear the Spanish officers and secure the entry points. If they failed to gain a foothold in the first 60 seconds, the mission was over. Then came the cable cutters. Imagine the nerves required for this. While the fighting rages above your head, While blood is literally dripping through the scuppers and onto your boat, your only job is to row to the bow and hack through two massive, salt-encrusted hemp cables. These weren't threads. They were as thick as a man's thigh. You had to chop through them with axes while the Spanish fired down at you from the forecastle. If those cables didn't part, the Hermione remained a sitting duck for the 200 shore guns. Finally, the sail losers. This is perhaps the most British part of the entire plan. While the ship was still a battleground, while pistols were discharging and steel was splashing on the decks, a hand-picked group of sailors was ordered to ignore the fight entirely. Their task? To climb. To scale the rigging, go out onto the yardarms, and let fall the topsails. Hamilton knew that the only way to escape the harbour was to use the very wind that the Spanish thought was their ally. It was a masterclass in multitasking under fire. Let's look at the friction again. Within the crew of the HMS Surprise, there were internal rivalries that Hamilton had to manage. You had the veteran old salts who had served under the Nelson era, and the young, hungry midshipmen looking for their first taste of glory. Hamilton played them like a fiddle. He assigned the most dangerous tasks to those with the most to prove. He turned their personal ambitions into a collective weapon. In modern terms, this is delegation of risk. You don't give the hardest job to your best friend. You give it to the man who is most desperate for a promotion. It sounds cold, but in the 18th century, that was how you won impossible battles. The one goal wasn't just the ship, it was the trophy. Hamilton had specifically ordered that the Spanish flag must be struck and the Union Jack raised the moment the quarterdeck was taken. He wanted the Spanish governor in his castle to look through his telescope at the first light of dawn and see the British flag flying in his own harbour. It was psychological warfare at its finest. The technical stakes were staggering. If the boats arrived at different times, the Spanish would pick them off one by one. If they arrived too early, they'd be seen. If they arrived too late, the morning breeze would die down and they'd be trapped. Everything, literally everything, depended on the synchronized pull of those muffled oars. As they reached the final stretch, Hamilton stood up in the stern of his boat. He could see the dark mass of the Hermione towering above him. He could see the Santa Cecilia name painted on her stern, a name he intended to erase before the sun came up. He drew his sword. It didn't catch the light because there was no light to catch. It was just a cold, grey sliver of intent. Inside the boats, the men were checking their flintlocks. They knew that a single spark from a misfire could give them away. They checked their tomahawks. They tightened their grip on their pikes. There was no more talking, no more expert next-door advice. Just the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 100 men who knew they were about to step into a meat grinder. The plan was set. The boats were in position. The 6 boats, 1 goal strategy was about to be put to the ultimate test. They weren't just rowing toward a ship, they were rowing toward their place in history. And as Hamilton's boat drifted under the massive curve of the Hermione's bow, he reached out and touched the hull. The ghost was within reach. The silence of the harbour was about to be shattered by a British roar that would be heard all the way to London. Hamilton didn't wait for the other boats to hook on. He didn't wait for a signal. He grabbed the anchor cable, the very one his men were supposed to cut, and began to climb. This was it. The breaking point was seconds away. The Special Forces raid of the 18th century had begun. And God help anyone who stood between Edward Hamilton and his redemption. The silence of Puerto Cabello didn't break with a bang. It broke with a splash. As Hamilton's boat glided under the Hermione's massive bow, they were spotted. A Spanish sentry on the forecastle leaned over the rail, squinting into the gloom, and saw the dark, rippling shapes of the British boats. He didn't hesitate. He levelled his musket and fired. That single shot, a sharp crack that echoed off the stone walls of the San Felipe castle, was the starting pistol for a massacre. Hamilton didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He screamed the order, "Board!" In an instant, the silent service became a screaming whirlwind of aggression. The British sailors didn't use the ladders. They climbed the anchor cables, they scrambled up the rudder chains, they jammed pikes into the gun ports to use as makeshift steps. It was a vertical battlefield. Imagine trying to climb a slippery, salt-crusted wooden wall while men above you are thrusting down with 10-foot pikes and firing pistols directly into your face. Hamilton was the first man over the rail. Think about the grit required for that. He wasn't sending his men into a breach. He was the breach. As he vaulted onto the deck, he was met by a wall of Spanish infantry. This wasn't a clean cinematic sword fight. It was a brutal, claustrophobic struggle in the dark. The decks of the Hermione were cluttered with spare rigging, chicken coops and barrels, turning the ship into a deadly labyrinth. The Spanish were caught in their hammocks, but they were professional soldiers. They poured out of the hatchways, half-dressed but armed to the teeth. The first blow was a chaotic scramble for the quarterdeck, the brain of the ship. Hamilton knew that if he didn't take the wheel and the officer's territory immediately, the Spanish would be able to organize a counterattack that would blow his small force off the deck. He led his party toward the stern, his cutlass swinging in a rhythmic, deadly arc. To his left and right, his sailors were using violence of action to compensate for their lack of numbers. They weren't just fighting, they were clearing the deck like a modern SWAT team moving through a house, one room at a time, one bulkhead at a time. But then, the friction hit. The Spanish guardacostas, those patrol boats we mentioned earlier, heard the commotion and began to close in. They started raking the Hermione with grape shot. Think of grape shot as a giant shotgun blast of iron balls, each the size of a golf ball, designed to shred human flesh. The British were now caught in a devil's sandwich. They were fighting the Spanish crew on the deck while being fired upon by the Spanish boats in the water. This was the breaking point. Hamilton was struck. A Spanish musketeer fired from the shadows of the mainmast, and the ball tore through Hamilton's thigh. He hit the deck hard. In a modern documentary, this is the moment where the music slows down and the tension spikes. His men hesitated. They saw their leader fall. But Hamilton didn't crawl for cover. He dragged himself up by the binnacle, blood soaking his trousers, and screamed at his men to keep moving. He personified the resolute British spirit. He knew that if they stopped to help him, they would all die. Meanwhile, at the bow, the cable cutters were living through their own personal hell. Two sailors, armed with heavy felling axes, were leaning over the side of the boat, hacking at the massive anchor cables. Each stroke of the axe was a prayer. They were completely exposed. Spanish Marines were leaning over the bowsprit, firing down at them. One of the axemen was hit in the shoulder, but he swapped the axe to his other hand and kept swinging. Thwack, thwack, snap. The first cable parted with a sound like a cannon shot. The Hermione gave a sudden, sluggish lurch. She was no longer a fixed point. She was a living thing again. On the deck, the technical stakes had shifted. The British had secured the quarterdeck, but the Spanish still held the waist of the ship, the middle section. The Spanish commander, realizing the British were few in number, rallied his men for a desperate charge. They came on with fixed bayonets, a masterclass in traditional infantry tactics. Hamilton's sailors met them with the Navy way. They didn't have room to reload their pistols, so they used them as clubs. They used boarding pikes to keep the bayonets at bay. The fighting was so intense that the modern connection here is almost hard to find. There is nothing in the modern world that matches the sheer visceral horror of 100 men hacking at each other with cold steel in a space no larger than a tennis court. The smell would have been overwhelming. The acrid stench of black powder smoke, the metallic tang of blood, and the salt spray of the sea. Then came the master stroke. While the melee was at its bloodiest, the sail losers, those young midshipmen and sailors Hamilton had hand-picked, were high above the carnage. They weren't looking at the blood on the deck. They were looking at the canvas. They sliced through the gaskets, and suddenly, the massive topsails of the Hermione unfurled. The ship caught the light land breeze. This was the moment the Spanish nemesis realized they were losing more than just a fight. They were losing the prize. The Hermione began to move, sluggishly at first, then with increasing purpose. She was literally sailing away from her own defenders. But the first blow wasn't over. The San Felipe castle, seeing the ship move, finally opened fire. The heavy 24-pounders roared, sending massive iron balls screaming through the rigging. Splinters, long, jagged shards of oak flew across the deck like shrapnel. A single splinter could be as deadly as a bullet. Hamilton, still bleeding out on the deck, looked up. He saw the sails fill. He saw his men holding the line. He saw the Spanish retreating toward the hatchways, driven back by the sheer, relentless grit of the British boarders. The tactical breakdown was simple. The British had used speed and surprise to seize the controls. They had used raw courage to hold the deck, and they were using the enemy's own wind to escape the trap. But the fight was far from won. The Spanish were still below decks, hundreds of them, and they were beginning to fire up through the floorboards. The Hermione was moving, but she was a bleeding, screaming, splintered wreck, and Edward Hamilton, leaning against the wheel with a sword in one hand and a tourniquet in the other, knew the hardest part was yet to come. They had struck the first blow. Now they had to survive the counterpunch. The Hermione was no longer a ship. She was a slaughterhouse with sails. While the sail losers were high in the rigging and the cable cutters were hacking at the bow, the center of the world had narrowed down to a single bloody patch of timber, the quarterdeck. This was the breaking point. If Hamilton's men lost their grip on the wheel now, the ship would drift onto the rocks or back under the castle's heavy guns. The Spanish crew, finally shaking off the paralysis of the initial shock, surged up from the after hatchway. They weren't just sailors anymore. They were a desperate, cornered nemesis. There were nearly 400 Spaniards on board against Hamilton's remaining force, which, by this point, was likely fewer than 80 effective fighters. In any tactical manual, those odds are a death sentence. But Hamilton's men didn't have the luxury of reading manuals. They had the grit of men who knew that if they fell, no quarter would be given. The fighting on the quarter would be given. The fighting on the quarterdeck was so close, so intimate, that muskets became useless. You couldn't reload. You couldn't even aim. Men were using the butt end of their pistols to smash skulls. They were using broken boarding pikes like quarterstaves. Hamilton, despite the ball through his thigh, was at the heart of the storm. He was a masterclass in resolute leadership. He stood by the binnacle, using it for support, parrying thrusts with a heavy naval cutlass that was notched and dulled from hitting bone and steel. Imagine the tactical imagery of this moment. The deck was slippery, not just with seawater, but with the butcher's bill of the previous 20 minutes. Every time the ship lurched, men lost their footing. To fall was to die. A Spanish officer, a man of immense bravery, charged Hamilton directly. This wasn't a choreographed duel from a Hollywood movie. It was a scramble. Hamilton was hit again, this time a jagged blow to the head with the butt of the musket that cracked his skull and sent him reeling. But here is where the human hook of the Royal Navy shows its teeth. As Hamilton went down, his sailors didn't flee. They didn't surrender. They stepped over their fallen captain and formed a jagged semicircle of steel. They fought with a special forces ferocity that the Spanish simply couldn't match. You see, the Spanish were fighting for a prize. The British were fighting for their lives and their honor. That psychological edge is what wins battles when the numbers say you should lose. In the modern world, we talk about force multipliers technology or tactics that make a small group as effective as a large one. In 1799, the British force multiplier was the boarding pike. While the Spanish were largely using swords and knives, the British used these 10-foot wooden shafts tipped with steel. They could keep the Spanish at a distance, thrusting into the mass of men before the Spanish could even get within striking range. It was a vertical and horizontal barrier that the Spanish charge broke against, wave after wave. The air was thick, heavy and nearly unbreathable. Between the sulphurous rotten egg smell of black powder and the steam rising from the warm blood hitting the cool night air, the quarterdeck had become a vision of hell, and through it all, the ship was turning. The sail losers had done their job too well. The Hermione began to gather way, but without a steady hand on the wheel, she was yawing wildly. One of Hamilton's midshipmen, a lad who couldn't have been older than 16, saw the danger. He crawled through the melee, dodging blades in boots, and grabbed the spokes of the wheel. He steered the ship by instinct, keep her head pointed toward the open sea while the battle raged inches from his head. That is the kind of tactical precision that saves empires. At the same time, the Spanish nemesis tried one last, desperate gambit. A group of Spanish Marines had barricaded themselves in the cabin area below the quarterdeck. They began firing their muskets upward through the wooden planks of the deck. Imagine standing on a floor that is literally spitting fire and lead at your feet. British sailors were being hit from below, falling without ever seeing the man who shot them. It was a breaking point in every sense. The British were being squeezed from the front, the sides, and now the very floor beneath them. Most men would have leaped overboard. Most men would have thrown down their arms. But Hamilton, regaining consciousness and wiping the blood from his eyes, ordered his men to fire back, not at the Spaniards they could see, but through the deck at the ones they couldn't. They took heavy 32-pounder cannonballs, just the balls, no powder, and dropped them down the hatchways. The logistics of violence in a confined space. The heavy iron shattered the barricades below, and the screaming stopped. By the end of this phase, the quarterdeck was silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the creak of the rigging. The British held the brain of the ship. They had paid for it in pieces of themselves. Hamilton was now a map of scars, a bullet in the thigh, a fractured skull, and multiple splinter wounds. But he was still standing. He looked at the Spanish flag, still tangled in the rigging, and gave the order to haul it down. In the modern world, we look back at these moments and wonder how men endured it. We translate the value of money and the strategic stakes, but we struggle to translate the resilience. Today, this is the grit that built the world. This wasn't a clean victory. It was a bloodbath that was bought with every ounce of British resolve. The Hermione was moving. The quarterdeck was won, but they were still inside the harbour. The 200 guns of San Felipe were finally fully awake, and the Santa Cecilia, or the Hermione, as she was rightfully becoming again, was about to run the gauntlet. The blood on the deck was barely dry, and the real test of seamanship was about to begin. The Hermione was no longer a stationary target. She was a moving fortress of agony. But as the ship began to find her stride, catching the land breeze with her topsails, the Spanish nemesis on the shore realized their prize was slipping away. The San Felipe castle didn't just fire, it erupted. This was the most tactical and terrifying phase of the night. Imagine a ship the size of a small apartment block trying to navigate a narrow channel in the dark while 200 heavy cannons are trying to turn you into kindling. The tactical imagery here is staggering. To the men on the shore, the Hermione looked like a scarlet caterpillar of muzzle flashes and flickering lanterns, slowly crawling across the black glass of the harbour. The Spanish gunners weren't aiming for the hull anymore. They were aiming for the sails and spars. They knew that if they could bring down just one mast, the ship would lose her momentum, pivot in the current, and drift helplessly back toward the beach. Every time a 24-pounder fired from the castle, the air itself seemed to bruise. The sound wasn't a bang, it was a physical blow to the chest. On the deck, the British sailors were living through a masterclass in psychological endurance. They had just finished a desperate hand-to-hand struggle, and now they had to stand perfectly still at their stations while iron balls screamed overhead. Hamilton, propped up against the binnacle, was a resolute shadow. He knew the logistics of escape. He needed the ship to maintain at least 4 knots to clear the headlands, but the wind was fickle. It was a what-if moment that has haunted historians for centuries. What if the breeze had died? What if the Hermione had simply stopped? The British would have been pounded into the seabed. Suddenly, a Spanish shot tore through the main topsail. The canvas didn't just rip, it exploded in a cloud of hemp and dust. The ship lurched. The sail loosers, those young men still high in the rigging, found themselves in a vertical nightmare. They were being swung back and forth like pendulums as the masts groaned under the pressure. In modern terms, this is like trying to repair a high-voltage power line during a hurricane while someone is shooting at you. It is grit in its purest, most terrifying form. But Hamilton had planned for this. He didn't just have sailors, he had seamen. While the Spanish gunboats continued to swarm the Hermione's flanks, firing grape shot into her sides, the British crews worked the braces with rhythmic, mechanical precision. They weren't shouting, they weren't panicking, they were following the expert next-door instructions of their midshipmen. They trimmed the sails to catch every stray puff of air, coaxing the wounded ship forward. Inch by agonizing inch, let's look at the modern connection. The value of a ship like this was immense, but the tactical data was even more important. By sailing under fire and surviving, Hamilton was proving a fundamental rule of naval warfare. A determined crew in a moving ship is almost impossible to hit accurately from a fixed shore battery at night. The Spanish were firing at where they thought she was, but the Hermione was a ghost in the smoke. Then came the breaking point for the Spanish gunboats. Seeing that the shore batteries were failing to stop the ship, the Spanish launchers tried to row alongside and board her again. It was a reversal of the night's earlier events. The British, who had been the attackers, were now the defenders. They ran to the great guns, the Hermione's own 12-pounders. Because they didn't have the time or the men to properly manhandle the heavy cannons, they used a tactical shortcut. They loaded the guns with double-shotted grape and fired them at point-blank range. The recoil of the guns was so violent it nearly tore the ring bolts from the wood, but the effect was devastating. The Spanish launchers weren't just hit, they were erased. The water around the Hermione became a churning mess of broken oars and sinking wood. Through the chaos, Hamilton remained the anchor. He was losing a massive amount of blood from his thigh, and the wound to his head was beginning to swell his eyes shut. But he refused to go below. He knew that the moment the crew lost sight of their captain, the redemption would fail. He was the personification of the high-retention leader, the man who keeps everyone's eyes on the prize when the world is literally falling apart around them. The Hermione finally cleared the last of the headlands. The heavy guns of San Felipe Castle could no longer bear on her. The sound of the shore batteries faded into a dull, distant thudding. The ship hit the open swells of the Caribbean, her bow cutting through the whitecaps with a renewed purpose. The tactical breakdown was complete. In less than 2 hours, 100 men had rowed into the most impossible trap in the Americas, fought a bloodbath on the decks, and sailed a massive frigate through a sailing under fire gauntlet. As the first hint of grey light began to touch the eastern horizon, the British sailors looked at each other. They were covered in soot, blood, and the salt of the sea. They looked like ghosts themselves. But when they looked up, they saw it. The Spanish flag was gone. In its place, tattered but proud, flew the Union Jack. The Hermione had been retaken. The Hermione had been settled, and as the ship found her rhythm in the deep water, the men began to cheer. It wasn't a loud, boisterous cheer. It was a low, guttural roar of resolute men who knew they had just done the impossible. They had sailed through the mouth of hell and come out the other side with the most valuable prize in the world. Their honor. The Hermione was no longer a Spanish prize, but as she wallowed in the morning swells, she looked like a floating tomb. The butcher's bill for the night's work was staggering. Of the Spanish crew, nearly 120 lay dead on the decks. On the British side, and this is the technical masterclass of the raid, not a single man had been killed during the boarding. Not one. It was a statistical anomaly that speaks to the sheer violence of action and tactical precision Hamilton had drilled into his men, but the price of valor was written on the bodies of the survivors. Hamilton himself was a shattered man. He had been stabbed, shot, and bludgeoned. His recovery would take years, and he would carry the grit of that night in his limp and his scars until the day he died. But the Admiralty didn't just give him a pat on the back, they gave him a knighthood and a seat at the table of legends. Yet, for the Royal Navy, the story didn't end with a medal. It ended with retribution. You see, the Navy has a memory longer than the Atlantic is deep. The mutiny of the Hermione had been an existential threat to the service, and the hunt for the remaining mutineers became a global obsession. This is the modern connection to the hunt for war criminals. British agents tracked these men for over a decade. They found them in the back streets of New York, in the merchant docks of Liverpool, and even serving under false names on other British ships. Whenever a Hermione mutineer was caught, the result was the same: the yardarm. They were hanged as a masterclass in deterrent. The message was clear: you can betray the crown, and you can run to the ends of the earth, but the silent service will never, ever stop looking for you. It was a cold, resolute pursuit of justice that defined the era. But what of the ship? The Hermione was renamed the HMS Retribution. It was a literal attempt to wash the ghost out of the wood. But even with a new name and a new crew, the ship carried a heavy atmosphere. Sailors are a superstitious lot, and many believed the decks were still haunted by the screams of the officers Pigot had let down. The ship was eventually broken up in 1805, the same year Nelson fell at Trafalgar. It was as if the Navy was finally ready to let that dark chapter turn to ash. The distichs of honour had been satisfied. The prize money from the capture was distributed among the crew, making many of those 100 men wealthy enough to never pull an oar again. In today's money, the bounty was worth millions, but if you asked them in their old age, sitting in a tavern in Portsmouth, they wouldn't talk about the gold. They would talk about the night they rode into the impossible trap. They would talk about the weight of the cutlass and the smell of the smoke. The price of valour isn't just paid in blood. It's paid in the lifelong burden of being a hero. Hamilton spent the rest of his life as a celebrity, but he was a man haunted by the nemesis of his own success. He had reached the pinnacle of naval glory before he was 30, and everything that followed was a slow descent. As we look back, we see a story of a redemption arc that is almost too cinematic to be true. It was a raid that redefined what a small, elite force could achieve against overwhelming odds. It proved that in the face of tyranny from within and fortresses from without, the British sailor was an unstoppable force of nature. The bloodiest cutting out remains a pillar of naval history, a reminder that no ship is ever truly lost as long as there are men brave enough to go and get her. So, why does the Ghost, the single 18th century frigate, still haunt our cultural imagination? Why does the name Hermione, and the man who reclaimed her, still carry such weight today? It's because the bloodiest cutting out wasn't just a skirmish. It was the birth of a legend. If you've ever sat down to watch Master and Commander or turned the pages of the Patrick O'Brian novel, you've walked the decks of Hamilton's ambition. The HMS Surprise, the very ship that launched those 6 small boats, was immortalized as the vessel of the fictional Captain Jack Aubrey. The grit, the tactical precision, and the sheer expert next-door charisma of Edward Hamilton provided the DNA for the most iconic naval hero in modern literature. But the legacy goes deeper than books and films. Let's look at the modern connection. In the Royal Navy today, the spirit of the Hermione raid lives on in the SBS, the Special Boat Service. The DNA of a cutting-out expedition, the muffled oars, the nighttime insertion, the surgical violence of action, is the direct ancestor of modern maritime counter-terrorism. When we see elite teams boarding ships today, we are seeing the 21st century evolution of Hamilton's 6 boats, 1 goal philosophy. And what of the lineage of the men themselves? The British 65-plus audience knows that history isn't just about dates, it's about bloodlines. Captain Edward Hamilton lived to see the dawn of the Victorian era, a walking monument of the Georgian age. His family continued to serve the Crown, and his story became a masterclass in leadership taught to generations of midshipmen at the Royal Naval College. Even Winston Churchill, a man who understood the value of resolute action better than most, looked back on the cutting out of the Hermione as one of the finest examples of the British spirit in the face of impossible odds. The harbour of Puerto Cabello is different now. The San Felipe Castle still stands, its stone walls weathered by the salt air of Venezuela, a silent witness to the night the scarlet caterpillar crawled through its shadow. You can still visit the site, and if you stand on the ramparts at midnight, you might almost hear the rhythmic thud of muffled oars. The name Hermione was so tainted by the blood of Pigot's tyranny that the Royal Navy refused to use it for nearly 70 years. It was as if the Admiralty wanted the name to be exorcised from the registry. But when they finally did commission a new HMS Hermione in 1871, it was seen as a final signal that the debt was paid. The butcher's bill was closed. In the end, the story of the Hermione is a reminder that history is a cycle of betrayal and redemption. It reminds us that no matter how deep the stain of a nemesis like Hugh Pigot, the resolute courage of a few can wash it clean. It's about the grit to do what is necessary, the tactics to do it well, and the honor to remember why we do it in the first place. As we close this chapter on the Royal Navy's most violent act of redemption, ask yourself, what would you risk to reclaim your honor? Would you row into the mouth of 200 guns? Would you climb the chains of a ghost ship? Edward Hamilton and his 100 men did, and because they did, their story will never be lost to the fog of history. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the blood and the brine. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the tactical imagery of the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We have more stories of grit and glory coming your way soon. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your powder dry.